Hello folks, Jack here from Peach Guitars, and in today's episode of Board Talk I'm going to talk through all things Jimi Hendrix. But before I do so, please remember to like this video, comment down below with your thoughts, and make sure that you're subscribed to the YouTube channel. Okay, as I said, very simply today is about Jimi Hendrix and celebrating all things therein. I kind of wanted to do this as a way of breaking down some of the kind of different myths about Hendrix's tones and the different ways that he would approach setting up his rig, and also to try and demonstrate the lineage in which his tone changed from his kind of onset of 65, 66 kind of time period right through to the latter stages of his career in 69 and 70, and how his tones changed and shaped with the different types of music that he was making. So I think a lot of people are aware of this anyway. But case in point, I've got here, for example, the 4 Icon series Hendrix pedals from Dunlop. And within that line, there's 2 different fuzzes. And I think there's sometimes a little bit of confusion as to which one represents which kind of era, which tone is going to be better suited to which particular type of Hendrix tone you might be going for, and so on. So I kind of wanted to break this down into a couple of different segments. So I'm going to show you some tones that I think best represent the earlier period, as I said. And then also I'm going to delve into the later period as well, the kind of Band of Gypsys era. And not only using the Dunlop products that I've got here as well, I also wanted to throw in a bit of fun to kind of try and get a vibe of some of that studio stuff that Hendrix was famous for when he was working with Eddie Kramer in the studio as well, kind of in the mid-period of his recording career when he was using reverse delay and lots of these studio techniques that Eddie Kramer really pioneered with him. As is always the way with these videos, I'm not trying to recreate any particular album or live tone to an absolute T. I've really just picked out the gear that I think best represents that time period, and I'm going to do my best to instill a few different flavourings of what I think Hendrix kind of went for with his playing at that time as well. And I'm going to discuss with the 2 different setups that I've got in this video the different playing styles that I think best represent that gear as well, if that makes sense. So it's not just going to be a kind of deep dive into Hendrix's playing and tones, it's also my own take on what made each of these different sounds unique to one another. So for the context of the rest of the rig, obviously I'm going to focus mainly on the pedals because that's the thing I'm going to change the most between the 2 sounds. I've also got 2 different custom shop Fender Strats. On your left I've got a 64 Strat, which I used for the earlier Are You Experienced kind of era of Hendrix tone. And then to your right, I've got the custom shop limited edition Hendrix Strat, which is more of a reference to his later sort of Woodstock era guitars as well. Amp-wise, I'm just using exactly the same amp for both, same settings as well, the Friedman Dirty Shirley amp, which for anyone who's aware of Hendrix's history of Marshall amplifiers, when he started out he was using more of the kind of JTM 45-100 amps, which were very big and bassy sounding, and I've tried to kind of get that vibe out of the Friedman. So it's very clean but very loud, and using a fair bit of bass and mid-range. And the earlier tones I think are a little bit more plummy in the mid-range. They have a little bit more punch to the tone, and I think the 64 Strat really exemplifies that very well. Going for the later tones, it's a little bit brighter and more aggressive, and that's where the Hendrix limited edition white Strat is going to come in. And you're going to hear that reflected in the different choice of pedals that I'm going to use as well. So kind of you hopefully get an understanding when I'm playing the pedals and using them in different ways that each guitar is suited a little bit better to those different eras of tone. Okay, so to dive into this first setup that I was using with the Sunburst 64 Strat, I kind of, as I said before, I think this is kind of what surmised his early setup. If you're going for earlier Hendrix tones, the kind of Are You Experienced through to the Electric Ladyland stuff, so kind of I guess 66 to 68 if you really want to group it like that. And basically throughout this time period I think Hendrix's tone was a bit cleaner and a little bit more to do with the amp tone, if you see what I mean. So as I said before, the intro where I was talking about the way he used his Marshalls in the early days, they were just really big, loud, clean amplifiers. And you really hear it on the first record in particular, just how clean his tone was. All of the gain, in fact, was coming not only from just the amp being really loud, but also the use of a germanium fuzz. So that's why I'm using the red fuzz face Hendrix pedal, which I believe has germanium transistors, and it certainly has that response of an immediate cleanup on the guitar volume. And in fact, throughout the course of the clip you're going to hear, I barely ever turned it off, even for the really clean tones at the start of the clip. And that's kind of what Hendrix would do. He would use a high gain germanium fuzz pedal into a loud clean amp and just use the guitar volume for all of the dynamics. The only time, to my ear at least, when he would turn this off is when he was using the Octavio, which, as you can see from the settings, these are the exact settings that I used. The fuzz is barely on that pedal. It's really just to give that high octave tone. You hear that in solos like Purple Haze and a bit of Fire, I believe, as well. Certain tracks had real standout Octavia kind of a sound. It's just great fun to play with dynamically as well. And you can kind of use it in conjunction with this fuzz as well. And it's all about, as I said before, working the guitar volume, working the guitar controls, changing pickups and stuff like that. Because the tone is cleaner, I think it has a real difference in the tone when you do change things like that. And so that's very much reminiscent of those earlier Hendrix kind of tones, obviously coupled with the Hendrix mini Crybaby wah as well. The standard full-size Crybaby is going to work in exactly the same way, but I pulled out the mini one just for cosmetics, if nothing else. His wah tone in that period, I think, really revolved around the dynamics of germanium fuzz. So you really hear it, you can get that very clean, pure wah tone by using the fuzz going into the wah. So that's what you're going to hear in this video. And then when you do crank up the volume on the guitar as well, it sort of blooms and does that classic fuzz-wah combination thing. And then, as I said, just for a bit of fun, I threw in a Boss DD8 on a reverse delay with 100% wet mix, and it kind of emulates those tones, some of those tones that Hendrix had, just for textural parts in the studio. It is a lot of fun to play with, and you definitely get that atmospheric kind of a vibe happening very quickly. To my mind, my impression of how he used his tones differently throughout the ages, this is kind of the most typical setup for what I would be going for to visit some early Hendrix. Alright, so if I'm going to move on to the later era of Hendrix's stuff now, and as I said before, I'm talking kind of 69 to 70 here, when I think his tone got a little bit louder and more aggressive, a bit more brash, particularly for the tail end of, I guess it was like the Electric Ladyland stuff, the live stuff, Woodstock, and Band of Gypsys, had a bigger, more aggressive tone. I think part of that came from the guitar as well. He started to use more strats with maple necks more typically, which had a little bit more high-end edge. And also the most significant change, and the thing I really want to put across today, is the difference in the fuzz pedal that he was using. So I believe he used several different fuzz faces throughout his career. It's largely believed that throughout the course of his career, Hendrix made the shift from germanium-based fuzzes through to silicon-based fuzzes, and that's what the Gypsy fuzz in this lineup represents best. It's a lot more brighter, it's a lot more aggressive, it's a lot gainier as well. And it really has less of that dynamic clean tone nature that the early stuff does. You still can clean up the tone just by turning the guitar volume down, but it's really more of an aggressive tone. And then coupled with the Octavio, for example, you get that kind of Band of Gypsys live album sound on tracks like Who Knows. And that just, it's still very quiet and dynamic if you want it to be, but as soon as you lay into it, it's got this real barky, octave up kind of ish effect. Still using the same wah, but in a slightly different way. I really used it more as a dramatic tone shaping filter, which is, I think, is kind of the vibe that Hendrix went with this higher gain tone. The wah has a more pronounced effect, and it's not necessarily that rhythmic Curtis Mayfield kind of thing that Hendrix did more in his earlier stuff. It's more about just being loud and brash with the wah. And then the other big significant change to his later tones is the inclusion of the univibe. And you really hear that on certain tracks, most notably, but also he sprinkled it in with his live stuff, famously on the national anthem at Woodstock, for example. The univibe was just another tool, I think, to basically not only make noise with, but also to shape the effects, the other effects that he was using. So in this video, I'm really kind of breaking this down into very simplistic ideas of how I personally perceive Hendrix used his effects. I'm sure there'll be a million different opinions out there on the internet, and I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are. Let me know in the comments below how you think Hendrix's choice of effects throughout his career changed and informed his playing styles. I really think that a lot of it was down to the different types of gear that he began to use. You really hear how the gear affected his tone, which I think in turn affected the music. That's just a matter of opinion. I'd like to know what you think as well. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this later era setup as well. To my mind, you can really pit the two against one another. The earlier stuff being a little bit more dynamic and clean, with this later setup being more aggressive and brash. Alright, so I hope you enjoy this. As I say, this is really just a little bit of a fun exploration of what I think made up some of Hendrix's greatest tones. As I said, I'm sure there'll be a million different opinions out there, so do feel free to leave in the comments below what you think were kind of the bedrock foundations of Hendrix's tone throughout the years and how things changed. I think it's a very interesting subject on a guitarist who had unfortunately, such a limited recording and live career. You really have to hone in on the finest possible details to make kind of flesh out the ideas that made up the difference in tones. Of course, largely it's to do with a Strat fuzz pedal and a Marshall amp. But hopefully this video just dispels a couple of those myths and maybe breaks down for you a little bit about what I at least think made up the intricacies and the differences in his tones throughout the ages. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have and you want to find out any more information about any of the products in this video, click the link down below and go to peachguitars.com. Though as always, take care of yourselves and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Cheers.